Good evening, and welcome to the 16-week webinar series entitled Sharia Crime, Comprehensive Training for Peace Officers, Social Workers, and Judicial Officials. Each week, we will focus on specific Sharia-sanctioned crimes that affect our local community. These are local communities where we have well-intentioned peace officers, social workers, and judicial officials who are unaware of what they don't know, and that by not having the training, they are actually unprepared to keep us safe, even if that's their intention. Tonight's presentation is entitled The Purge, the Training Purge, and the Plague of Self-Censorship. This training, the entire 16-week series, is being brought to you by Sharia Crime Stoppers, which is an affiliate of the United West. My name is Dick Manaseri. I'm a co-founder of the Sharia Crime Stoppers, along with co-founder Mary Wierbicki. Mary is the social media director at the United West, and our other co-founder, David Boris, who is our course developer and instructor, and will be presenting the material. We'll be taking questions as we can, and there will be a brief Q&A session this evening. This webinar is recorded, and as all further future webinars in the 16-week series, the recordings will be available on the Sharia Crime Stoppers page at theunitedwest.org. Finally, I'd like to introduce to you David Boris. David is a retired police chief. He's our course developer and our instructor. And David has 45 years of public service, 23 years in the Army's military police corps, where he retired at the rank of lieutenant colonel. 19 years after that, he was employed in civilian law enforcement as a senior deputy sheriff and police chief. Since 2012, David has been providing Sharia threat training for law enforcement across the Southeast to over 1,500 officers. He's also an adjunct instructor with the Center for Security Policy and the Clarion Intelligence Network. We're grateful that David has taken the time and energy to prepare this material and to present it. Our goal, David's goal, Mary's goal, our goal in Sharia Crime Stoppers is to make the American justice system great again, one professional at a time. David?
Thank you, Dick. All right, without further ado, the battle we're engaged in is a war of narrative and censorship, being fought through deception, lies, and intimidation to silence the truth. I hope you can see the caption on this particular screen. Gee, Pat, I don't have a clue. Workplace violence, huh? Armed and surgery? Can't I buy a bottle? That pretty well sums up what we're facing. As a reminder, we addressed during our promotional webinar how we have become blinded to this threat because of political correctness and the belief that Islam is a religion like all others, deserving full First Amendment protection. But we also learned there are numerous crimes sanctioned by Sharia that violate our laws. Nevertheless, the blindness continues. The terrifying fact is that will emerge from tonight's webinar is that the purge of training and the corresponding censorship about it was done purposely and willfully by senior government officials acting in concert with the Muslim Brotherhood to do their bidding. After tonight's webinar, it's our hope that you will have a better understanding of the true nature of jihadist threat and how it's been censored, why and how the government imposed training restrictions on all federal law enforcement and Department of Defense agencies concerning the jihadist threat, an understanding of the current Department of Homeland Security training guidelines to counter violent extremism, and how these guidelines prevent us from knowing the fundamentalist threat to America. We should be able to identify the attack motives of jihadists, learn how the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution is being circumvented by Sharia law. Our enemy has two axes of attacks on America. The first is the violent, overt jihadists, and followed by the second, nonviolent attacks by Muslim Brotherhood. Both complement each other. Tonight we will focus on the soft jihad, the efforts promoted by the Muslim Brotherhood to sabotage our government by focusing on Sharia crime of blasphemy and how all information about the threat has been censored. Sun Tzu was a Chinese military leader over 2,500 years ago who wrote The Art of War that is still being studied by military leaders today. What Sun Tzu said was, we have to know our enemy if we hope to be victorious. One of his most important principles. It is the importance of knowing our enemy if we want to be victorious. To this end, he gave us several questions to answer. Note at the top of the list is motive, or why does our enemy fight us? As we shall see, there has been a concerted effort at the highest level of our government not to answer these questions and not to even name our enemy. One senior Army officer dared to warn us, but we didn't listen. For 8 years of the Bush administration and 8 years of the Obama administration, we took the path of least resistance and allowed the Muslim Brotherhood and members of the progressive movement to direct how we should refer to the threat and how we must not refer to it. One consequence of this political mindset for law enforcement occurred in July 2013 when the FBI ran bolos for the world's most wanted terrorists in Seattle and offered $25 million for information to capture them. The photographs were posted on Seattle's public transit system. No sooner were the bolos publicized than the Council of American Islamic Relations and other groups cried foul. And Congressional Representative Jim McDermott demanded the FBI remove the ads. Why? Because only Middle Eastern men were depicted, and the information was racist and offensive to Muslims. Unfortunately, the FBI caved in. But Seattle wasn't the first attempt to censor information about the threat. In 2008, the Department of Homeland Security's Countering Terrorism Communications Center issued guidance on words that work and words that don't. The guidelines were published following recommendations and pressure made by the Muslim Brotherhood officials and their sympathizers and members of the Bush administration not to equate terrorism with Islam. Following the Department of Homeland Security publication in January of 2008, the Department of Defense Central Command issued a rebuttal in August. Obviously, the military could see the writing on the wall, and they knew they must attempt to counter the efforts of the Muslim Brotherhood to influence senior Bush officials. This was an obvious attempt to follow Sun Tzu's guidance to properly identify and know our enemy. The points made were, we must be careful not to label all Muslims as terrorists. We must be careful, too, that we are not willfully ignoring a problem that must be addressed directly and firmly. That it is entirely proper to address certain aspects of the threat as exclusively Islamic. And the fact that our enemies cite the sources of Islam as the foundation of their global jihad is acceptable. Unfortunately, political correctness got in the way and the advice was not followed. And the purge of our language about our enemy was off and running. Note the words along the left axis and the number of times they were used in the 9/11 report. Then note the number of times these same words have been used since in several key government documents, like the FBI's own lexicon manual, the 2009 intelligence strategy, and on the far right, the Department of Defense Fort Hood report, in which the name of the jihadist attacker is not even mentioned. The next acts to fall against knowing our enemy happened in 2011 when Spencer Ackerman wrote and published an article highly critical of the FBI's training program about the Islamic threat. Ackerman's article mobilized the Muslim Brotherhood and its officials to launch a final move to censor the language. On October 4, 2011, several Muslim Brotherhood front groups demanded the FBI purge its training, and one day later, the Muslim Public Affairs Council continued the pressure, followed by a Department of Defense statement that the vetting had started, which was promptly followed by the Muslim Brotherhood warning that if the FBI's training was not revised, relations between the Muslim community and law enforcement would suffer. The final blow came on October 19, 2011, when Veronica Carrera, president of the Muslim Advocates, an organization of Muslim attorneys, sent a letter to John Brennan, Obama's then Deputy National Security Advisor. The letter was signed by 57 Muslim Brotherhood officials and sympathizers demanding the training be purged. Before we get too deep into tonight's topic, let's do a little administrative house cleaning. Throughout our webinars, we'll be using three principal sources. The first is the Quran itself, believed by Muslims to be the exact words of their God, Allah, given to the last and greatest prophet Muhammad between 610 and 632. The next source are the recorded words and deeds of Muhammad, presumably by those who heard Muhammad speak or by those who witnessed his actions. And then finally, the third source, referred to as the Classic Manual of Islamic Sacred Law, or Green Book, that is recognized by both Sunni and Shia Muslim scholars. Let's see what the Green Book can tell us about the topic for tonight. Note how slander is defined. Don't say anything a Muslim would not like. Don't reveal anything that might be resented. And the Green Book covers how both slander and tale-bearing can occur in written materials. What I hope to recognize that neither definition of slander and tale-bearing have anything to do with the truth. In fact, you can be in violation of Sharia for telling the truth if it reveals something you don't like, or that may be resented if revealed, or that might be offensive. So for example, when I say that Muhammad was a pedophile because he married one of his wives when she was 6 years old and consummated the marriage when she was 9, that will probably be at odds with Sharia, even though the statement is in fact true. But what about Allah, the God of Muslims? What does he say about criticism? If they attack your religion with disapproval and criticism, then fight them. The recompense of those who do mischief in the land is they shall be killed or crucified or their hands and feet cut off. And it gets worse. Mischief, what does it mean? It means any act of disobedience for which the penalty is death or crucifixion or dismemberment. Obviously, this is a serious matter not to be taken lightly. As we shall see in the next slide, the Muslim advocates found much not to like about the FBI's training and in the various training material used in the classroom. In a word, they found the training offensive. Note the concerns raised. The FBI's used biased, false, and highly offensive training materials, and the Muslim advocates identified 13 problems and specified not only the FBI, but all law enforcement and military entities of the federal government. The solution. Establish an interagency task force led by the White House to purge all federal training materials or bias materials, implement a mandatory retraining program for those subjected to bias training. All trainers who promoted bias training are effectively disciplined. Ensure bigoted trainers and bias materials are not developed or used again. And issue guidelines of advocacy and are protected, not indicators of violence, and shall not be basis for surveillance or investigations. The immediate reactions taken in response to the Muslim advocates' demands were by senior Obama officials who took an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, the same oath that many of us took. In fact, the first PURGE directive came on October 22nd from the Department of Justice and was issued by Dwight Holton. The second PURGE order was issued by John Brennan himself on November 3rd, 2011, to the Department of Homeland Security. And the final PURGE directive was given by General Dempsey, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, on May 3rd, 2012, to all military components, active and reserve. And immediately after the directive's release, General Dempsey went after one of the trainers to send a message to others in uniform. Islam is protected. Reza Khalili, a CIA operative, was the second trainer removed because of CARE, found he had a political agenda against Islam. In other words, he was deemed offensive. Another example of offensive training material was a target used by the Navy SEALs depicting a hijab-wearing female warrior and the need to have authentic combat scenarios. The target was pulled because of CARE's insistence. Even though there was ample evidence that U.S. forces would face armed female jihadists in battle. In September of 2015, Judicial Watch issued a report detailing how law enforcement training materials were purged by the federal government. The report referenced a February 8, 2012 meeting between then FBI Director Robert Mueller and Muslim Brotherhood representatives from the Islamic Society of North America and the Muslim Public Affairs Council, both unindicted co-conspirators in the Holy Land Foundation trial of 2009. At this meeting, Mueller gave the attendees a progress report of the FBI's purge of documents to date, to include 160,000 documents reviewed, 700 of which, along with 300 presentations, were deemed unacceptable or unusable and purged by as yet unnamed subject matter experts believed to be employed by the Counterterrorism Center at West Point. As for the connection of the purge of the FBI documents and training materials to Hamas, a Palestinian terrorist group, the Holy Land Foundation trial clearly proved that CARE was the fundraising arm for Hamas in America. And who uncovered all this evidence? Why, special agents of Mueller's FBI. So one more look at the red team's warning to know our enemy. The source of Islam claim divine origin and include a large body of Islamic jurisprudence on warfare that is detailed and directive. We should not be afraid to analyze Islam and its tenets without prejudice. And finally, the use of Arabic words or terms should never be censored or discouraged where it is absolutely necessary for understanding our enemy. But by now, the warning was too late. The purge was complete and remains in effect, sadly, until today. The current Department of Homeland Security guidelines are still posted and available to the general public on the internet, at least the last time I checked. So do's and don'ts from the Department of Homeland Security. Don't use training of unsubstantiated theories, like many mainstream Muslim organizations have terrorist ties and are fronts for Islamic organizations desiring to establish Sharia law in America. In other words, totally ignore the evidence uncovered during the Holy Land Foundation trial that clearly linked the Muslim Brotherhood and several of its organizations and members to Hamas, and showed further the Muslim Brotherhood's goal to eliminate America and replace it with Sharia law. All this should be ignored and not covered in law enforcement training. Don't use trainers who are self-professed Muslim reformers. In other words, don't use Muslims not affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood for trainers who are working to reform Islam from within. They have an agenda, and the Muslim Brotherhood does not. Don't use training that equates religious expression with criminal activity, such as equating the desire for Sharia law with criminal activity. But what about all the criminal activity sanctioned by Sharia? All the Sharia crimes that were listed at the beginning of this webinar, are they to be ignored? Are they now considered protected by the First Amendment and untouchable, like wife beating, female genital mutilation, jihad, the rape of non-Muslim women? Don't use programs that venture too deep into the weeds of religious doctrine and history. We can't help but wonder why. And one positive note, develop and use a common language or terminology that is not offensive to Muslims and by definition is therefore inaccurate and meaningless. Terms that connote or connect an ideology to a crime are to be avoided. Is it any wonder why we can't figure out the motive of jihadist attacks? So who wrote these guidelines? Remember the Muslim Brotherhood's demand to form a senior level task force to purge all federal training and come up with something acceptable to the Muslim Brotherhood? Well, here it is, the Countering Violent Extremism Working Group in the Department of Homeland Security, made up of several members of the Muslim Brotherhood. First, Mohammed Majid, former president of the Islamic Society of North America, a Muslim Brotherhood front group. Omar al-Amari, a Muslim with extensive ties to several Muslim Brotherhood front groups. And then there's Delia Mogahed, senior Obama official in the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. And Mohammed al-Bayri, another Muslim Brotherhood affiliate and defender of the 1993 World Trade Center co-conspirators, here being sworn in to the Department of Homeland Security. Nadia Romani, director of the Muslim Leadership Institute, who invites speakers from the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. Deputy Chief Michael Downing of the Los Angeles Police Department, who has worked with and is an apologist for the Muslim Public Affairs Council and CARE, both front groups for the Muslim Brotherhood. And finally, Richard Cohen, Executive Director of the Southern Poverty Law Center. All who made sure we know nothing about our jihadist enemy and who developed countering violent extremism policy that we'll look at shortly. So what are the principles that these individuals adopted as they fulfilled their oaths to protect our country? Don't say or do anything to validate extremism as being connected to Islam. Don't provide ammunition to the Muslim Brotherhood. We're at war with Muslims. Extremists take verses in the Quran out of context and to distort Islam. And they are violent because of extreme ideas outside Islam that justifies violence, which makes their actions extreme. Look closely at the words of our former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson. Note he doesn't deny that there's a religious connection of jihadists to Islam. We're just not going to talk about it because it might offend Muslims, just like we were worried about offending Germans and the Japanese during World War II. And then we have the useful idiots who continue the deception about our enemy. So what happens when the language of the Quran and jihad are purged? The results are deadly. Later we'll look at the specific warning signs missed prior to the Fort Hood attack because of the purge. And then there were the warnings prior to the FBI prior to the Boston attack, all ignored or not understood. And neighbors who saw suspicious activities prior to the San Bernardino attack, but were fearful to say anything. And what about more recently? The Las Vegas attack on October 1st, 2017. Because of poor training, are we missing or ignoring important clues? Clues that may uncover a jihadist motive of the attack. Here are 40 of the 50 pictures of 40 of the 58 who were killed and 500 wounded. Immediately after the attack, before the crime scene had been processed, before any information was uncovered about the shooter, the FBI discounted any link to ISIS or Islam, even though information became public indicating otherwise. First, ISIS claimed responsibility immediately, almost as quickly as the FBI rejected any connection to it. And then we learned that Stephen Paddock may have converted to Islam 6 months prior to the attack, and that he had made multiple trips to the Middle East, that 200 of his foreign transactions were flagged for financing terrorism. And we learned he sent $100,000 to his girlfriend, perhaps to pay off any of his remaining debts, which must be done in accordance with Sharia to become a martyr. Just like the San Bernardino shooters, he tried to destroy his hard drive while the FBI deleted information before returning devices to their owner. Then we learned Paddock had rented 2 adjoining rooms, both used as firing positions, the smaller occupied by another individual who claimed on social media he had been hidden for 3 hours during and after the attack. Finally, on October 5th, last month, 2018, the Las Vegas sheriff issued the final report saying we can't find a motive for the attack. Another example of missed clues. Christmas Eve, 2017. Muhammad Arbrari Ali drove a red Cadillac at 120 miles per hour directly into the path of a California Highway Patrol vehicle, killing Officer Andrew Calmeri, married with 3 children, injuring his partner Jonathan Velasquez. Since the incident, there has been a virtual news blackout about the case, even though several key questions remain uncovered. Did Ali follow ISIS commands to use vehicles to kill infidels or non-believers of Islam? Did Ali follow ISIS commands for its followers to kill Americans and to specifically target police officers? And finally, should any of these questions even be asked when the perpetrator is a Muslim? So what has the Department of Homeland Security's Countering Violent Extremism Training Guidelines gotten us? Well, we treat all threats alike. It doesn't matter where they come from, what their beliefs are, what their motive is. With no understanding how jihadists differ from any other of these groups. The closest we come to naming the threat is to call them right-wing extremists or lone wolves inspired by ISIS, but no mention of what inspires ISIS or any jihadi group for that matter, or we lump them all together, making all threats equal and equally dangerous with no connection to Islam. This is the current face of political correct censorship. Now take a close look at this statement that underscores the FBI training. Mere association with organizations that demonstrate both legitimate advocacy and illicit violent extremism objectives should not automatically result in a determination that the associated individual is acting in furtherance of the organization's illicit objectives. This is the equivalent of saying the piano player in the whorehouse should not automatically be associated with the illegal activity transpiring behind closed doors, or associating the driver who was stopped on the interstate with a trunk full of drugs as having anything to do with the illegal drug trade. The real problem with the FBI's guidance is that it violates federal law. The Supreme Court case of Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project states that no support of any type can be provided to a named terrorist group. To be associated is to be providing material support. Returning to Sun Tzu, he again tells us why we must understand our enemy as he really is, not as we wish him to believe. One problem we have is that many of our leaders study the wrong information about jihadists. A case in point is this book written by an officer in the United States Navy and chair of the Islamic Studies of the National Defense University. This book has had a significant impact on our military leadership, many still on active duty today. The book focuses on why jihadists don't follow true Islam. Let's assume for a moment the author is correct. We still must understand our enemy and what he believes, by how he defines himself, by reading what he writes, tweets, or says on social media, in Arabic. Now, look who endorsed the book. This sanitized, politically correct policy totally ignores reality and the overwhelming evidence about the true nature of the Islamic threat. Fortunately, there is some accurate information about our jihadist enemy. The New York City Police Department issued this report in 2007 and clearly labeled the ideology behind the radicalization of domestic jihadists and why we can't ignore it. We need to be intellectually honest about diagnosing the jihadist threat if we're going to know what to fear. Let's see who else is telling us what to fear. Reported by the Middle East Research Institute on December 6, 2016, the former dean of the Islamic Law at Qatar University, Dr. Abd el-Hamad el-Ansarat, says, stop blaming Islamic extremism on poverty or the West. Islamic extremism is being taught at Islamic schools and in mosques and has existed for 1,400 years. Recently published Canadian report addresses the importance of Islamic religion to motivate foreign jihadists. Surprise, it says, study shows Islam plays key role in motivating individuals to become foreign fighters for jihad. And what about jihadists? What do they tell us about their motivation? From the International Center for Countering Terrorism at The Hague in October 2016, concluded it's Islamic ideology that is the principal motivator. Another study that was recent in January 2011 concluded after talking with jihadists, it's implausible to suggest religiosity is not the primary motivator for their actions. Then there's Zano Baran, a Muslim from Turkey, now an Islamic scholar, provides the link between radicalization to jihad and the ideology behind it. She calls it the first step to jihadi terrorism is instruction in Islamic ideology. Then there is a former Muslim jihadist, Dr. Tawfiq Hamad, who states, fighting the underlying ideology, the theology of Islam, as widely practiced, is key to defeating radicalism. And more evidence on the cause for radicalization to jihad reported by two French authors. And their principal conclusion, we cannot deny the religion effect. Among young Muslims, it is 3 times more important than non-Muslim groups. The purely economic explanation appears not to be validated. In a lengthy study comparing 10 religions in Denmark by Denmark researcher Tina Marad, concluded Islam is the most violent religion. Even with all this evidence, there are many who refuse to acknowledge it within the highest levels of our government. Facts get in the way. Let's see what they tell us about the motive for jihadist attacks in America. Although this webinar is about the soft jihad and how the Muslim Brotherhood views blasphemy and attempts to censor any discussion about the Islamic threat to America, we need to turn now to exactly what it is the Muslim Brotherhood does not want us to know about the threat. And that is who our enemy is. Believe it or not, he has some definable characteristics. Since 9/11, all of the jihadists who have attacked the United States look like this. They're either second or third generation Muslims or converts to Islam, pursuing Islamist goals, which is key to understand the motive. Or they may be a small like-minded group, such as a husband and wife or two brothers, all radicalized locally with a lot of outside help, who desire death or martyrdom. Motive has two dimensions, that which triggers an event as distinguished from its underlying cause or ultimate cause. Since 9/11, we have been given a variety of reasons for terrorist attacks, none of which hit the bullseye, all of which have been the proximate cause. For example, the Ohio State vehicle attack was caused by a Muslim who was afraid to pray in public. Or the cause for the San Bernardino attack was a Christmas party. Or attacks occurred because of hate against Muslims. Or Islamophobia. Or in the case of Faisal Muhammad at the University of California, who stabbed 4 fellow students because they removed him from their study group back on November 4th, 2015. Or because the West is attacking Islam, or maybe because of Trump's policies on refugees, or our support for Israel, or because of a cartoon contest in Garland, Texas, or video that caused Benghazi. Or terrorists are bored because they cannot find a job. And what about climate change? And now mental illness is the current culprit. Fort Hood was workplace violence, and Little Rock was classified a drive-by. All triggering events or attempts to deflect us from the true motive. For all jihadists, the root cause remains today as it has been for 1,400 years, just like the 9/11 Commission found, and many others. The common denominator is the ideology. Now we can more accurately express and define the attack motive. Recently, Daniel Greenfeld has written an article that says Allahu Akbar is the reason for jihadist attacks. The phrase means that Allah is greater than all other religions and is the motive for jihadist attacks, not only to demonstrate Allah's greatness, but to impose it through Sharia over mankind. Whenever there is an attack, we want to know, is it terrorism? Federal law defines it as violence or life-threatening acts to intimidate the general public in order to influence our government through violence within the boundaries of the United States. The next issue to resolve is whether the terrorist act is committed by a jihadist. Answering these non-politically correct questions will give us a clue. Is the perpetrator, in fact, a second or third generation Muslim or convert to Islam? Is the perpetrator pursuing Islamist goals? Remember, it's the key to unlocking the motive. Or was the attack committed by a small like-minded group, team, or cell working independently from outside control? Is there evidence that the perpetrators were radicalized and even desire martyrdom? Don't let the politically correct crowd or believers in multiculturalism mislead you. This is a different threat. It's global to impose Sharia over mankind. It's far more deadly than any other terrorist threat. All jihadi groups are at war with us, while the soft jihadists are trying to subvert our Constitution because they all believe they are obeying Allah, their God, and are more than willing to die for these beliefs. The last capstone document that outlines the threat to our nation was released December 2017 by the Trump administration. Finally, it identifies the threat by name and labels jihadists the most serious threat to our nation, all wanting to establish a global Islamic state through violence and slavery, all justified by 109 violent verses in the Quran, to eliminate America and its way of life by using the World Wide Web and domestic networks to radicalize jihadists and to plot attacks. Obviously, the FBI at the Detroit field office didn't get Trump's memo. One of its members, Bushra Ali, insists jihad is an inner struggle, and for her it's not to eat cheesecake. How enlightening. She has bought into the soft jihad and its attempt to purge what we should know about the threat. Sun Tzu tells us the importance of why we must understand the moral foundation of warriors. For he says, the moral law causes warriors to be in complete accord with their leaders, so that they will follow him, regardless of their lives, undismayed by danger. And from the 9/11 Commission, our strategy must dismantle the Al-Qaeda network and prevail over the ideology that contributes to Islamist terrorism. In conclusion, infiltration of the government and self-censorship began with the Clinton administration. Openly challenging the U.S. government through political pressure is the final nonviolent phase of the Muslim Brotherhood's underground movement plan. We cannot effectively fight an enemy we don't acknowledge, define, or discuss. Article 6 makes the U.S. Constitution the supreme law of the land. All public officials must take an oath. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Unfortunately, we are now being forced, because of Sharia law against blasphemy laws, that makes it prevail over our Constitution and makes us unable to comply with our oath of office. When a peace officer is being prevented from fulfilling his oath of office by someone, it constitutes obstruction and is considered a felony. For more information about this topic, read Stephen Coffin's book. This ends our webinar tonight about one aspect of the soft jihad used by the Muslim Brotherhood. We will look into their activities in considerably more detail in future webinars. But first, we need to look more closely at the second axis of attack against us. Jihad through violence will be our topic for next week. And remember that both axes complement each other. So next week, the beliefs of the Muslim fundamentalists, the three types of jihadi threats to America, the concept of leaderless resistance as the principal means of attack jihadists have used in America since 2005, the defining characteristics of jihadists and how they have targeted peace officers, and examples of the various jihadi threats to our nation to include our southern border, and finally the ultimate objective of Islamic jihad.
Okay, we will do a couple of questions for the Q&A session. David, if you'll stay on camera, we're going to cover a couple of questions. One of the questions was asked, and I will answer this one, is whether or not we would provide certificate of completion at the end of the 16 weeks. And the answer to that question is no. The main reason that we will not be providing certificates of completion is that this course is being offered as 100% confidential to all participants. And one of the other reasons is that we are not placing any controls on the attendees to know when they attend, how many they attend. So with this being 100% confidential, we will not be providing certificates of completion. Let me go to a couple of other questions for David. One of them is, why is there reluctance on the part of our political officials to label the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization?
Well, interesting you should say that, because recently Egypt has published its feelings on this, and all attributed to John McCain by labeling him the ultimate leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, because it was he that introduced the Muslim Brotherhood into our government and made sure that nothing was done to circumvent it. Just ask Michelle Bachmann of what happened to her when she dared question Uba Ahmadine's affiliation within the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. An investigation was demanded, and yet John McCain ensured that it was shut down. The other reason is because of money that is given by the jihadists and their organizations to political campaigns. And finally, all it takes is a signature from the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who has shown his willingness of wanting to do it, but I'm sure right now he's tied up with other more pressing matters, especially in North Korea. So that is pretty much a thumbnail sketch of why so far it has not been done.
Why do you think President Bush failed to properly label the Muslim threat to America?
Well, I think some of it was out of ignorance, and I think some of it was because the Muslim Brotherhood got to his advisors, advised them about how President Bush should respond, and he did their bidding. Unfortunately, he wasted an opportunity for 8 years of his administration to properly educate us on the threat. I know he was concerned right after 9/11 there might be a backlash against Muslims through violence, but that quickly wore off, and he could have used his time to educate us about the threat, but he did not. In fact, quite the contrary, his administration launched into the words that work and words that don't phenomenon that we saw earlier tonight.
You talked to us about the CVE tonight. Great presentation, by the way. Who selected the members of the CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, the working group, who were affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood?
That's a good question. I certainly haven't been able to find out. Maybe others have, but I don't know who actually appointed all of them. I know the Secretary of Homeland Security swore them into their posts of office, but as for who actually selected them, I do not know.
Why hasn't the purge of the training been reversed under the Trump administration?
Another good question. We've been expecting that for the last 2 years, but I think the officials of the Muslim Brotherhood, many of them are Obama holdovers, are resistant to make that change. And so far, it has not come from the top to do so.
That's the end of our questions for tonight. I will turn it back over to Dick to close us out. Great presentation, David. Excellent information. And Dick, I'll let you close us out.
Thank you, Mary, and David, thank you very much. We are continuing. This was just week 1 of the 16-week series. Week 2 will be next Tuesday night at 7 p.m. The material will absolutely be broadcast completely, and we will have an active Q&A session. The threat, as David, the topic, as David has said, is the current threat. It turns out that next Tuesday is an important date in history. It is September 11th. And we must never forget 9/11. That was the day that Sharia adherent individuals committed the crime of mass murder on US soil. And that's a crime for which we know the motive. The motive is unmistakable. It was and is the Islamic Sharia ideology commanding the murder of non-believers just because they're non-believers. And in some cases, believers are actually may have perished on 9/11, and that was just necessary for the cause. So we've seen 9/11, and as we remember 9/11 next week, we would invite you to think about the first responders that you know. Invite them to register for the rest of the course. Invite them to spend with you next Tuesday night on 9/11 with the material, with the course, to see that as a meaningful tribute to the first responders, bravery of the first responders on that 9/11 17 years ago. So we thank you very much for your attention tonight, and we invite you to join us next week, 9/11, 7 p.m., and pick up the rest of the story as we proceed with the 16-week webinar. Thank you very much.